Hey guys, what is going on? So I wanted to talk about an often overlooked way of improving your strength, and that is doing self-limiting variations with versions of the lift that you really are not good at, that you kind of naturally suck at, okay? And this is kind of counterintuitive because most people are going to naturally gravitate to what they're better at, and they're going to avoid the things that they're worse at. And this is more than just saying, okay, I need to bring up the weak link in my chain. I need to focus on something that I'm weak at. It's less that and more so that the way that your skeleton is actually shaped is going to dictate how certain lifts actually stress a certain muscle group, right? So we do have that example of somebody who, he has long arms and therefore he is better at deadlift, and then he's worse at bench press. And so he shies away from the bench press. It doesn't grow very much. But his deadlift goes up a ton because he loves to deadlift. Okay, so those are two very different lifts, right? And one is, immediately better because of the long arms, and one is worse because of the long arms. Or vice versa, somebody having short arms, they love the bench press, hate the deadlift. But this can oftentimes be more so kind of something that's associated with differing lifts within the same group. So for example, if we're talking about squats, the difference in your actual bone structure is going to dictate how your muscles actually respond to a given lift, right? So your skeleton plays a big role in how you actually, if you like the lift, if it's something that actually activates the muscles that you're going for versus somebody else. And this can actually even be like, hey, me and my friend were the same height, but my femurs are really long and his femurs are really short, right? So for him, maybe he's able to stay really upright when he's doing a squat. Maybe he gets a lot of knee bend. He's able to get really good depth. He gets a lot of quad activation. And he probably loves the squat for that reason. It's a very easy lift. Getting depth is not an issue. Quad growth, leg growth sees a lot of positive kind of reinforcement from doing squats. So not only is that person more likely to do squats, but they're going to get more out of it from a quad perspective, right? The person with longer femurs, which, I'm one of those people, squatting can be a little bit more difficult in terms of hitting depth. You're going to fold over a little bit more. It's not going to be as pretty. The knee bend that you're able to get out of just a normal squat, especially if you're doing, low bar squats, is going to make things even worse in a lot of instances. That's going to make you not like the squat as much, maybe not get as much quad activation out of it. So you have one person who's developing crazy quads, and therefore, squat movements in general are something that they very much enjoy. They're probably really good at the front squat naturally without any, actual practice. They're probably pretty good at SSB squats, everything like that. The other person who is more hip dominant, okay, they are not going to naturally have a very high front squat if it's going to be a lot more emphasis placed on the quads. They might be really bad at SSB squats. They might be bad at heel elevated high bar squats or just high bar squats in general, right? So these are two people who maybe squat just as much, but one person needs a lot more practice with the quads, not only in terms of bodybuilding movements, but also doing actual squat variations. So this, could be an advantage and a disadvantage because there are obviously other advantages associated with different, bone lengths and different things. But I'm just saying that somebody who squats just as much as the next guy is probably going to need to supplement with, hey, maybe my hip activation is very high when it comes to my squats, and I'm also doing deadlifts as well. So I'm getting a ton of hip activation as opposed to me doing 2 competition style, low bar squats per week. I can actually pull one of those per week, or maybe you don't even do low bar squats at all, and that's something you only do every once in a while. And you say, hey, I'm going to do a more quad bias lift. I'm going to do maybe an SSB squat. Maybe I'm going to do a front squat. Maybe I'm going to do high bar and or, heel elevated high bar squat. So there's a whole bunch of different things that kind of go along with that. And the similar thing can be true with something like bench press. Somebody with long arms might be like, oh, naturally not too good at bench press, but at the same time, the range of motion that they're getting on their bench press can make it a better bodybuilding lift. Or maybe that person naturally likes incline bench. An incline bench has a little bit more of a range of motion. So as a bodybuilding style move, if you're able to take the triceps through a larger range of motion, you might get more tricep strength out of that. You might get, more hypertrophy, everything like that. So that person, might have that advantage of, hey, I'm going through a larger range of motion. There's more of a bodybuilding style movement. I need to focus less on accessories. Whereas the person who has short arms, maybe they get a lot out of their chest, but when they, bring the bar down, they're still above parallel. They're not getting a lot of tricep range of motion. They're getting a lot of explosion out of their chest at the bottom. Their range of motion is less, and so their arms don't really grow much at all. And even if they bring their grip in close, close grip bench press, their tricep activation might not be there. Okay, so there's all these different variables, but the best way that you can kind of go about this is say, okay, this is my bench press. What should my close grip bench be? And if your close grip bench is really bad, it's probably a good sign that that's something you can work on. Or maybe that means that you need to work on your triceps with more accessories and do the close grip bench press. Or in the case of the, squatting person, maybe that person needs to do leg extensions to grow their quads and do quad bias squats. Whereas the other person who, has shorter femurs and stays really upright on their squat, maybe that person gets by only doing squats. But hey, they need to do RDLs and they really need to grow their posterior chain for their deadlift, right? And their lower back needs a little bit more work. All of these things, it's not necessarily one is good or one is bad. Long arms, like I said, that's going to make it a little bit harder to bench press, but at the same time, you're getting a greater range of motion. You might get a better hypertrophy response, better growth potential by simply doing that lift, whereas the other person has to hammer their accessories, right? So, I think a lot of people would be better off just experimenting with all these different variations and figuring out, hey, this lift, this variation of this lift, I'm disproportionately weak at. Why is that? It's because, you have this skeleton issue, you have this imbalance. Let me bring up that muscle group via, those variations that are self-limiting, that are really bad for, your skeleton. And then you can also go ahead and add in extra hypertrophy movements to bring up those muscle groups. Okay, so that's something that I think a lot of people don't even think about. They're just like, oh yeah, squat, bench, deadlift. If you improve your bench, you're just going to get bigger, right? But it's different for every single person because of the way their skeleton is. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to actually focus more of your compound lifts on the areas that you're bad at. And again, maybe you get a ton out of squats. You don't need to do any quad bias movements, and you can just do your squats. You can even do low bar squats and get plenty of quad activation. And that means you can allocate more volume to the other lifts that you don't need to do that on. So it's not to say that you need to do a bench variation, a squat variation, and a deadlift variation, but maybe depending on where you're weak at, you want to work on one of those and then bring up, the muscle groups that are involved in that to be able to make that not really a weak point. And that's kind of, the weak link in the chain. You want to bring that up, but you also want to always know kind of like, hey, this is how my skeleton is. This is just something that I'm going to have to program in kind of indefinitely. Like I'm always going to need to bias the quads a little bit more because they don't get a natural activation based on my skeleton. So if you can figure that out early, you might not waste years of just doing a lift thinking it's going to do something for you when it doesn't, right? Or maybe, there's even a time where, let's say you have long arms, you do the bench press, you do close grip bench, but it's just not a good tricep builder for you for whatever reason. And your triceps may be plenty strong. You might get tons of range of motion, tons of actual strength out of the bench press, but not a lot of size. So you can go ahead and, figure that out. Okay, this is how I've been doing this. I'm not really getting a positive response out of that. Let me add some bodybuilding lifts in there to bring up the triceps because the bench press isn't getting it done. So it takes a lot of just understanding that you are an individual person. You have your own differences in your skeleton, and it makes sense to figure out what you're bad at and what you need to work on and not just go off of a cookie cutter. Oh, the best way to build your quads is just squat, because that's not always going to be the case for everybody. So hopefully that helped. Something that I've kind of been experimenting with for myself here recently, just kind of going down the rabbit hole of looking at how, different lifts affect me. And it makes a lot of sense. So hopefully that helps somebody. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I'll keep you updated and I'll talk to you soon.